Good afternoon. I'm Carl Peters, this year's president of the New Jersey Association of Professional Mediators, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you to NJAPM's first annual forum on cultural competency. This program is being offered at a time in our nation where we need to come together. We all need to use our best efforts to listen to one another to gain understanding. We need to be open to seeing that we all have different perspectives on issues based on things such as our age, education, experience, gender, religion, race, and more. Mediation is a process that relies heavily on improving communication. I believe the information provided in today's program will help all of us to communicate more effectively. Judge Lawrence Jones has assembled an impressive team of panelists for the two-day program. Today's program is geared towards divorce and family mediation, and on March 9th, we'll present a program more aligned with civil mediation. While each of these programs has a slightly different focus, I think that we will all get something useful out of each of them. Before I turn the program over to Judge Jones to introduce today's speakers, I'd like to say a few words about NJAPM. The New Jersey Association of Professional Mediators is a group whose mission is to promote mediation as the preferred way to resolve disputes. We're a diverse group, not only by gender, race, and religion, but also by professional background. Many of our members are attorneys, but we also have members who are experienced in other professions, such as education, labor relations, mental health, accounting, and even a couple of engineers like myself. Among the ways that we promote the use of mediation is by offering training to improve the quality of mediators. This year, we have been able to provide many webinars, some of them offering continuing education credits, some not. For those of you that took a civil mediation program years ago, we offer a 6-hour training to help you obtain the credentials for acceptance on the court's roster. This program starts next week on February 23rd. For those of you who are interested in entering the field of divorce mediation, our basic 40-hour training starts in April, and the program for both of these, registration for both of these programs rather, is open right now. We hope that you enjoy today's program and find it useful. If you like it, considering becoming a member of NJAPM to enable us to create more informative programming. With that said, I'll turn the program over to Judge Jones. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl, and welcome to all attendees to our first annual Cultural Competency for Mediators program, which we hope will be an annual and growing event. We're really excited about this program. We've worked on it for quite some time because it's really critical for mediators who are in the profession of helping people resolve differences to know how to work with people from completely different backgrounds, not only between themselves, but perhaps from the mediator, in order to help build bridges and reach resolutions, both on the family side as well as the civil side. As President Peters indicated, we have a program today for family mediation, and then we have a part 2 for civil mediation on March the 9th. There are downloadable materials for everybody who has signed up for the program. Please take the opportunity to look through them. If you haven't already, look through them after the program. In particular, there is a list of links that I think you're going to find very valuable of multiple different articles from authoritative sources and experts on the area of cultural competency, but also the last 2 items in there. Please note that there is a self-test for implicit and unconscious bias, which we'll be talking about perhaps in more detail in the March 9th proceeding, but it's still a very good test to take for yourself. And also, there is an LGBTQ resource guide on phrasing, which was originally distributed and prepared by the New Jersey State Bar Association. So please take the opportunity to look through the materials. Cultural competency, cultural, relating to culture. Culture is not limited to one's nation of origin. Years and years ago, people would say, what country are you from? So that's your culture. But culture has taken on a much more expansive role, especially in the context of cultural competency. It relates to ethnicity, it relates to race, it relates to religion, It relates to gender, to age, to sexual orientation, to physical or developmental disability, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. It's very expansive. And on top of cultures, there are many subcultures. So many people are members of different subcultures. The point being is that it's a heterogeneous concept. You can never assume before meeting somebody, because they perhaps associate with some type of culture or subculture, really much about them until you talk with them. Otherwise, you risk overgeneralization and stereotyping, which you never want to do. But it's very important for mediators, dispute resolution professionals, to have an open mind towards receiving information from people from various types of cultures and understanding that no matter what the issue is, people may have different views than each other or from you, and you need to be open, constantly open to understanding other people's points of view, based in part upon cultural competency, as well as all of the other trainings that mediators involve themselves in. We have a really outstanding panel today, and on behalf of NJAPM, I want to extend my appreciation to all the panelists who are offering their thoughts and their wisdom today relative to the issue of cultural competency. We have with us Honorable Judge Lisa Thornton, who is the first female African-American assignment judge in the history of the modern New Jersey court. She sits in Monmouth County, sits in Freehold, New Jersey. She was appointed to the bench originally in 2008, has served in the civil and criminal divisions as well as the family division, where she had served as presiding judge for many years. And as presiding judge, she developed the Law Clerk Boot Camp to enrich the experience of recent law school graduates who are training for their legal careers. She has also served on the Supreme Court Advisory Committee on Extrajudicial Activities. She received her undergraduate degree from Douglas College, Rutgers University, and her JD from Rutgers School of Law in Newark. And she's also presented with me on the annual From Classroom to Courtroom program for graduating law students and law clerks. And I know she's an outstanding speaker, and I'm so thrilled to have her with us today. And she's also served as a guest speaker at Monmouth University with me as well. Raj Saadeh is the founder and sole member of the law office of Raja Saadeh LLC. He devotes a substantial portion of his litigation practice to matrimonial and family law. He also serves as an appointee to the Supreme Court of New Jersey's Family Practice Committee and is a trained law mediator, family law mediator. He's also the immediate past chair of the Young Lawyers Division of the New Jersey State Bar Association. So the next wave of attorneys and law leaders, he chaired their particular section, and was a trustee of the New Jersey State Bar Association, and also is the past president of the New Jersey Muslim Lawyers Association, and a member of the New Jersey Commission on Professionalism in the Law. And I've also had the great opportunity to co-present with him in other forums as well. He's an outstanding speaker, a very dedicated professional, and we'll learn a lot from him. Ken Newman comes to the mediation field, having been trained as both a child psychologist and a family therapist. He's been working in the field of divorce for more than 40 years. Ken is one of the founders of the Center for Mediation and Training, and since 1987, he's been involved in the training of over 1,000 mediators. Now 1,040 if we count today, Dr. Newman, right? Ken has been at the forefront of developing new mediation techniques and processes, and Ken has served on numerous boards, including the Academy of Professional Family Mediators, the Association for Conflict Resolution Family Section, the Association of Divorce Financial Planners and Child Find of America. Alfonso Hernandez Jr. is the founder and president of Resolve Divorce Center, LLC, located in Rutherford, New Jersey, providing divorce mediation, dispute resolution, divorce coaching, and life coaching services. He is also presently a member of the NJAPM Board of Directors and the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and a committee member with the Academy of Professional Family Mediators. Joni Jones, RMBC, is a registered nurse, board certified in psychiatric and mental health nursing, and a retired member of the New Jersey Board of Nursing. She's a member of the New Jersey Association of Professional Mediators Diversity and Inclusion Committee and Cultural Competency Program Committee, and has written and presented on the issue of cultural competency and autism spectrum disorder and disabilities for the Academy of Professional Family Mediators. She'll be talking about that today a bit. Ms. Jones has served as a guardian ad litem for the courts in matters involving children with ASD, and she is also a former mediator in multiple municipal courts. So again, we have an outstanding panel, and hopefully you will all agree by the end of the program that you've learned a lot during the program. Now, what we're going to do essentially is we're going to present the program, and at the end of the program, if you have questions, any of the participants have questions, you can put them into the Q&A, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. The first question I'd like to ask is of Judge Thornton. Judge Thornton, why is cultural competency relevant in family law practice?
So I will say that when we had an opportunity to speak last week, Judge, you said, well, Judge Thornton, you are an expert and you love to talk about cultural competency. So I'll just say, I am not an expert. I am not an expert. I will say that when we presented the panel, Professor Werble, we had speak at the vicinage on cultural competence, I guess based on some of her work at Seton Hall. And I will say one of my colleagues at the Administrative Office of the Courts, Lisa Burke, really is an expert. And she studied the social science, right? That whole aspect. What I do have a specific knowledge is I've been Black my entire life, right? And so when we talk about issues of diversity, implicit bias, which all these things, cultural competence, they all are interrelated, right? And some of the same concepts. I've experienced all of those my entire life, right? And so when we talk about, is it important in family law? Well, if it's important in our greater society, and we, as you started at the top of the program, Judge, and I think Mr. Peterson, maybe even before we jumped on, talked about the importance at this particular time in our country, as all of these issues converge. If it's important in our society, it's important when we talk about family law, right? Because hopefully the mediators are going to have a much better outcome. I think a couple years ago when I spoke at the state bar, they had the Thurgood Marshall Award, and just preparing for some of those limited comments that I made, we talk about the studies, and the social science really does show that when you put together groups of diverse folks in a workplace, they are far more successful than groups that are not diverse, right? And I think the reason is they're put in a position where they really do have to cross barriers, and oftentimes they become more creative. And so when you approach and make the argument about why is diversity, why is cultural competence, I usually always try to approach people with the idea of what's in it for them, right? You always do. And if folks understand that what's in it for them is we can have a more successful organization, or I can have a much better practice as a mediator, folks will see the reason, aside from the greater societal needs of why it's important. Now, what I wanted to go back to and take a couple seconds, Judge, is talk about really what is cultural competence, right? Because we hear a lot of terms. I myself had to go back and look, and I got some of the working definitions from Georgetown University, right? And they say that cultural competence is a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system or agency and enable that system or agency and those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. 5 essential elements that contribute to cultural competency include valuing diversity, having the capacity for cultural self-assessment, right? I always say, you know what? Because when you talk about, I think in the next program that folks are going to be asked to take the implicit bias test. Everybody's got implicit bias, right? I tell this story about how Jesse Jackson said he was walking down the street in New York City, and an African-American man approached him, and he crossed the street. And he said, what does that say about me? There's another gentleman that spoke at Judicial College that is, I think, the deputy counsel for the ACLU, an African-American gentleman. And he said when he took the implicit bias test, he says, oh, this is wrong. Something's wrong with this test. And he took it again. And he said something's wrong with it because it showed that he had implicit bias against African-American men. And so I like to tell people that, to say that when we say everybody's got it, they come to the table with it, doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that we're socialized in a certain way. Number 3 is being conscious of the dynamics inherent when cultures interact. Number 4, having institutionalized cultural knowledge. And 5, having developed adaptations to service delivery. And I think that's the most important thing, reflecting an understanding of cultural diversity, right? And I think the difference is one thing to say, oh, I have an understanding of different cultures. It's another thing to say, I'm going to adapt my behaviors so I can better communicate with somebody from a different culture. And as you said, Judge, when we talk about cultures, we talk about different races, different religions, sexual orientation. As a judge, I've been lucky enough to handle so many of those cases, right? And so I remember I handled one case with a Chinese couple that emigrated to this country from Taiwan, right? And that was a big place in their divorce litigation, because the husband felt that the wife had assimilated far too much in our American culture. And throughout the trial, he was really bitter because he says, you've forgotten about Chinese culture. You've forgotten about Chinese culture. And when you look at some of the materials, you talk about that. Who's the dominant decision maker in that marriage or in that relationship, right? And you could tell throughout the trial, it was a contested trial on all issues. And looking back, I was like, maybe if they had a mediator that was a little bit more open and a little bit more educated to these concepts, maybe they could have done something. I had a case with a Jewish couple, and it was obvious to me that led to that all issues trial that I had to resolve. I've had same-sex trial, right? And there are issues. So it's also important, and I think you're going to ask this question later, that whether you be a Chinese family or an African-American family or a Jewish family or a same-sex family, it's important not to assume that all those groups have a certain culture or a certain thought process. And it's important, and I think we'll talk about this a little later. Don't always assume that all Chinese couples have that traditional culture that comes from China, right? Or all African-American folks are liberal, because they're not. A lot are really conservative and come from that Christian Baptist background, or that they have a certain family structure. And if we could just release some of those ideas that if you are from the dominant culture, that's right, and that you could say or do whatever you think you want to. I'll give you an example. Professor Werble, I think you'll remember when she presented, she gave one of these examples with cultural competency about hair, right? Black women and hair. And that's a huge thing, right? And how it's been remarkable or funny to me over the 50 some odd years of my life, how certain people will say certain things to certain people and not think anything of it, right? So Lisa Burke presented to our vicinage, and she talked about how sometimes people, if you see a woman that's overweight or heavy, right, like myself, and someone would come up and say to you, oh, you have a beautiful face. And they think that's a compliment, right? I guess it is, but what does that say? Everything, my face is beautiful, but the rest of me is not, right? Now, if I went to someone who necessarily wasn't overweight and I said, oh my God, you're hideous, you're so homely, that person would have been mortified, right? I was in Wegmans last week or so, chatting with the gentleman in line, and he looked at me, he said, is that your hair? And I said, I paid for it, so it really is my hair. Now, if you flip it around, one of my colleagues who is Caucasian, she had a ponytail or a bun. I knew it was not a real bun, okay? And so I decided this particular day I wanted to tease her a little bit. And I said to her, I said, hey, what's that on the back of your head? What's going on? She was mortified. And so I say that to say that when we're dealing with these issues of cultural competence. Think about what you say. Would you say that to everybody? Why is it that you feel more comfortable making those comments? So why did that gentleman feel so comfortable making that comment to me? Now, I wasn't really offended. Somebody else would be, though. Why did he feel so comfortable saying that to me? And if a Caucasian woman was in the grocery store, would he ask her, "Do you have a wig on?" Probably not. So as we develop these skills, it's not just the understanding, but it's developing these skills. I think that many of the mediators, as folks in our greater society, will find out that they're developing far greater skills to mediate those cases. They'll be in a position to bring in a greater number of clients, a more diverse group of clients. And when we talk about diversity, like I said, it's not always within Black and white. You have very traditional Italian families. You're going to encounter Jewish families. And it's important to know that there are differences. Their differences don't make them bad. Your differences don't make you good.
Thank you, Judge Thornton. And just in follow-up to that, nobody has to be an expert on every culture that's out there. You just have to have a mindset to be open to constantly learning and evolving. And the questionnaire, which is in everybody's materials, please do yourself a favor and just take the test before the March 9th proceeding. Just do it. And you might learn a little bit more about yourself than you previously learned as well, in terms of whether you do or do not have implicit biases, because there's a pretty good chance most of us do in some fashion or another. Ken, let me ask you this. What do you think, after having helped 1,000 people learn to be mediators, what do you think are some of the most important steps a family mediator can take to improve cultural competency and help settle family court cases?
Great question. Thanks. I've been thinking about this, and for a long time, I was wondering, having trained a lot of mediators and been involved in ongoing training, and many, many years ago, I was wondering, why were some mediators more successful than other mediators? I took that as a serious question, and one as a trainer that I needed to figure out. And I started looking at mediators, because I often got clients who came to me more in the early days of mediation, who started with another mediator and then didn't continue because one of the parties didn't want to continue with that particular mediator. And of course, I inquired why. And what occurred to me, what I found out, was that mediators who were impartial, that is perceived as impartial, now the only way to be perceived as impartial is in fact to be impartial, that those were the more successful mediators. And I speak in my trainings always about what bias, implicit bias, explicit bias, and that test, by the way, which I've taken numerous times, is a fantastic test. We should all take it, even before, we should all take it and have another meeting, next meeting, report on it. And when I say impartial, it really means, and I always look up words, of course, treating all parties equally, not biased, fair. And if you are impartial, you will be perceived as impartial. You can't fake being impartial. You can't fake being not biased. And we need to always examine what our biases are and where they come from. When do you cross the street kind of thing, when you see people coming in the other direction, that kind of thing. What are the cues we respond to? We all need, and I think John Haynes, and he says, you need to take a step in the other person's moccasins, which I prefer to shoes in that expression. It's a great thing that Haynes said, to walk a mile in someone else's moccasins. We really need to work so hard. If there's nothing else we work on to start with, is our ability to be in touch with our biases. When I teach about parenting issues, what biases do we have about that? What biases do we have when people come in from different backgrounds? What biases do we have if we see a biracial couple? We don't talk about that a lot. That's something I like to talk about. We need to be talking about all the time what our biases and prejudices are, and we need to be very in touch with it. To me, that's the most important thing I can share with people. And I'll answer other questions with that in mind. And let's always answer questions with that in mind. Everything we're reacting to everything all of the time. Right now, this panel, people are looking at the makeup of this panel, and what are people thinking? I'd be curious. People could share that in the Q&A. What are people thinking when they look at the makeup of this panel? Well, how does it strike people? I wonder. I'm just looking. I know everyone here from all of our talks, so I'd have a different reaction. I wonder what are the people who we have 60 people watching this. What are they thinking when they look at this panel? What was your first reaction? Okay, don't have to answer it, but I'm wondering. So we got to be in touch with what we're feeling. We got to be in touch with our biases. I can't emphasize it enough.
Thank you, Ken. What I'd like to do now for everyone in the audience is run through a series of proposed hypotheticals, types of situations that mediators may, in the course of their practice, perhaps come across if they haven't already. Understanding these are hypotheticals, but they all relate to cultural competency related issues, and then ask the various panelists, their thoughts on how they might handle the situation. So I'm going to put the first question out to Raj, the first hypothetical. Let's assume two people come into your office to mediate a divorce. They are naturalized American citizens, but they come from another country where they were originally raised and married. Further, both parties practice a religion which the mediator does not know. What might a mediator with no prior knowledge of their culture and religion do in terms of trying to effectuate a successful mediation?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Your Honor. This is something that, if it has not become a regular occurrence, it will become so. I mean, that's just the trajectory of our society, particularly in a more cosmopolitan state like New Jersey. So when you have two people who come in who want to mediate their divorce, odds are the first thing that you're going to have a handle on in terms of that they are not part of what I like to call the orthodoxy. So is by their names, by their accents. So if you see a name that perhaps is not as Anglo-Saxon, or perhaps is not some kind of a Western European ilk, that's going to tell you something, that they perhaps are not the more typical, the more common, for lack of a better word, couple that may walk in the door. So from there, along with their accent, you may ask questions to them in terms of where they come from, like what their story is, as that what brought them to New Jersey at this point in their lives, and really their trajectory in terms of how they got there. And that can kind of give you a heads up as to where they are more generally. And then from there, if that location or their country of origin is perhaps a little bit more foreign to you, you may want to ask them certain questions in terms of what their perceptions are as to what marriage is and kind of what divorce is. And that's important to kind of understand, because we have an assumption. A lot of people, everyone has some kind of an assumption as to what marriage is. We as lawyers or as mediators, we look at this in large part, not fully, but in large part from a very legal perspective, in terms of the marriage is a group of two people bonded together by a union, and a legal union, and the point of a divorce is to dissolve that union. Relationships organically are not as business oriented as that in any culture, at least most of the time. And having an understanding of what marriage is, what marriage means, will perhaps give you some understanding of what they are coming into your office with, their assumptions, their dispositions, and that can kind of give you a handle of what the next set of questions, which is what divorce is like. I mean, divorce, what it is here is very different than how it is all over the world. And it's not just in terms of rights and legalities. I mean, there are family dynamics that are involved in it, not just with the children, with tribes, with extended family. Sometimes there's political implications to it all as well. And all of that, asking about what a divorce looks like from there, is a good starting point. And I say a good starting point because they may not know that what you're asking for is really an understanding of what isn't orthodox to you, but to them, they may assume, not even consciously, but subconsciously, they may assume that everything that you are asking for, they may not give you all the answers because they assume that it's just common knowledge when it really isn't to you. And then from there, you get that initial information as to the marriage, as to the divorce, what that looks like from their perspective. And you do at least some kind of individual research to kind of get an understanding of how interfamily and marriage and divorce dynamics work in their country. Just be careful about doing that. Number one, because this is not a science. This is a humanities kind of course. It's a humanities topic. So it's not black and white. I mean, there are some, we're talking about, this is a cultural competency course or seminar, and there are some subjects. I mean, one of my majors in college was Middle Eastern studies, and the way that has, without dovetailing too much, the way that has kind of been taught in the West has been very scientific, as opposed to treating the people from that part of the world as human, and therefore very it's not very black and white. We're not treated like animals or anything like that. So that's a starting point, and then from there, talking to other people who are seeking out guidance and an understanding from people who you may know who are in your circles, or who may be on at least one degree of separation away, to try to get a handle of what kind of assumptions they might be having that they may not have explained to you, and that would be important for you to get them to a good starting point and onward to hopefully make the mediation ultimately successful. And the religion is in the same token. Religion and culture oftentimes is very intertwined. You can't really separate the two in a lot of places. So there's a lot of background homework that needs to be done. It can be done, and it's I think not only instrumental to a successful mediation, but I think it would give you credibility in the eyes of the people who you're seeking to help as well.
Raj, I think you make a really important point in that you said it's in mediation, it's a humanities-based exercise. It's a humanities-based exercise. That's a little different from what perhaps takes place in a court, where it's more structured by what the law says. And so many of our mediators are also attorneys, that the role you may play is much different in a courtroom than in a mediation in terms of how you're trying to reach your ultimate goal. You have to connect with the people. You have to connect with them in the humanities-based way. And in a courtroom, that might not necessarily be as critical, although it's still helpful, obviously. But I think that's an excellent point to make. I want to move on to the next hypothetical. Alfonso, I'm going to put this one out to you.
Okay.
Hypothetical number 2. You're mediating a divorce between two parties. The parties come from a culture which is very male-dominated. It appears during the mediation that the man is controlling or attempting to control the mediation. What might a culturally competent mediator consider doing in such a situation?
Well, I'm going to answer this in two ways, because I saw some pitfalls after I thought about this question a few times. Number one is the curiosity that a mediator brings into the case with the couples can really show your impartiality. So asking questions and trying to understand the dynamics of how the couple were during their marriage, understanding that is this really a cultural based situation or imbalance between the couple, or is this more of the dynamics of who they were should be kept in the mind of the mediator? Freud had done a lot of discussions into our responses, conscious and unconscious responses. And what he found was a lot of unconscious responses were due to defense mechanisms. So, we want to be aware of that and realize that. So that's where a situation like this, where you see an imbalance in the couple, I tend to move towards and suggest utilizing caucuses. so that you can talk with each individual better and understand what their dynamics were, what their how they work together, what their belief systems are in the situation. As Judge Thornton had talked about before with the Taiwanese couple, is it important for the woman now to assert herself more than in the relationship that was prior to their decision to make a divorce? So in caucuses, you could at least understand and work towards having both sides understand their differences and their thoughts to try to get them to work towards together a good settlement that works for both of them in that situation.
And just in follow-up, if you have the same situation, but you get the sense that one party or the other, perhaps in this hypothetical, the woman is not sharing personal information for cultural reasons, perhaps due to hesitation, feelings that she doesn't want to disclose certain things because it's not within their custom to do so, then how do you handle that type of situation?
Well, ask her about it. Ask her about her dynamics with her own family initially to understand better, and give her a safe space to be able to communicate that. She may not still want to be that way within joint session, but at least that you can understand her position. And that's where I think the strength of a caucus with each party gives you that understanding when you bring them back together.
If you see there's an issue, create the safe space immediately.
Right.
Okay. Ken, I want to come back to you for hypothetical 3. This is something which comes up very, very often, it seems, the feedback we've been getting. The parties come from a culture with extensive family making decision dynamics. In other words, people making the decisions perhaps are people who are not in the mediation room. Somebody's father or mother or aunt or uncle, whatever the case may be. Do you allow third persons into the mediation? Do you allow them to participate in some fashion? And what are the pros and cons of how to handle that type of dynamic culturally?
Well, thanks. As I was hearing the last answer, I was thinking of this particular case. There was a couple who I was seeing, they were getting divorced. They had an arranged marriage in another country. They were both professionals. Their grandparents knew each other, and their divorce was being spoken about in the country that they come from. I realized at that point that the parents were very much a part of this from some insult that had taken place. I actually had each party, the husband and the wife, come in with their parents to a session. I invited it. I met with them separately, each party and their parents, and that was very helpful. I then met with the 4 parents who knew each other. They were very unhappy about their children's divorce. I met with the 4 parents then together, something I had never done before with anyone else up until that point. Though once having done it, you start realizing there may be other situations where you need to consider such things. It worked out very well. The whole situation worked out very well. And I learned from having made that decision and having done it successfully to extend that practice more often than I would have previously ever thought to do. So yes, the answer is yes, you need to bring the people in.
But it would generally involve getting the pre-consent from both sides to do that.
Everyone agreed. That's correct. Yes, of
and
course.
Also keeping, for those in the audience, if you're ever considering doing that, bringing in a third person, even though it's consent, because mediation is consensual, it may be a good idea to have there be a signature by the third person.
Yeah, everyone signed the appropriate releases. In fact, yeah, some of the people were attorneys themselves, so it worked out well, but everyone understood that. But I think it was a way of expanding my own experience and my own thinking going forward as to who should be at the table, so to speak.
Right. So sometimes the one the mediator has to persuade is not either party, but other persons who are culturally assisting either party, as the case may be. Good advice. All right, Joni, hypothetical number 4, the persons with disabilities. A party enters mediation who's on the autism spectrum for high-functioning Asperger's, what used to be called Asperger's, high-functioning autism. What may be helpful for a culturally competent mediator to know in certain cases regarding high functioning autism and the syndrome?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for bringing up this hypothetical, because I run so many times into situations where there's stigmas attached to this. Many mediators might not even know somebody with Asperger's syndrome or high functioning autism is in the mediation process, because many are very successful business people, very smart. Unless they divulge it, unless a spouse or partner divulges it, you might not even know. And on top of that, I'd like to bring up the point that if there is a child that's involved in the mediation process, that sometimes parents might have traits or have the diagnosis themselves, because there is a genetic link to this. So I'm going to go over some of the traits just to bring up some of the competency, related to autism spectrum disorder, also known as ASD. And in some individuals, you may see some fleeting eye contact. So they may not be able to look at somebody for long periods of time, because this is a disorder of communication and socialization. And it may be very uncomfortable for them. It's not that they're being evasive. It's also not because they're not telling the truth, which are some of the biases that are associated with lack of eye contact. It's also important to note that every individual is unique within this disorder. Some may have more intensity of the traits, some may have less or more of it. But also when we're working with adults, some adults have had through their experiences the ability to adapt. So you may not see some of these things so prominently as you will see in others. So some individuals may have sophisticated language, and they may use some words that you simply have never even heard of before. And it's okay to seek clarification. There's also some individuals that have literal translation. And the importance of this is when you're building trust and rapport, if you're going to say, okay, we're going to take a break and we're going to come back in 10 minutes, and it's been 15 or 20, they're holding on to that 10 minutes. And very literally, because you didn't say around 10 minutes, this may affect their ability to go rapidly with that trust and the rapport, which is very important in the mediation process. Some individuals have a lot of difficulty staying on topic. If it's not an area of interest to them, it may be very difficult for them to engage or reciprocate in that conversation. However, if it is a topic of their interest, they can go on and give really a lot of minute detail about that topic. Also, in conversation, they can get easily distracted in some of the cues. So you can say a word and then they can go off, somewhere thinking about that word. So that may be another reason why it's difficult for them to stay on topic. Some individuals are very perseverative. So if you have completed talking about a particular topic and then you're moving on, in their mind, they may have wanted to say something and they didn't bring it up. So they may be perseverating in those thoughts and not able to move in because they're still back there. So you may see some individuals that have a flat affect. You may see some individuals that have very loud tone, and they're not realizing that they're speaking so loudly. Also, there may be some misunderstandings in reading facial cues or gestures, and that can go both ways because some individuals have difficulty pairing what they're feeling with the emotion. So they can look like they're mad or they're getting angry, and really underneath all of it, there's really a degree of sadness. So also in some traits, I just want to touch upon some sensory processing. Some may have sensory integration dysfunction, and they could have what's called hypersensitive hearing. And there can be background noise that can become very distracting, even if there's type of vibrations like a refrigerator or a fan or an air conditioning unit that can be very, very distracting. You might see individuals with very low tone, and if you have them write something, you may not be able to understand what they're writing because their handwriting can really be illegible. So also there's clothing issues that some people are very sensitive to the certain textiles and the tags. So in the mediation process, if you just remember to say, hey, dress comfortably, that could go a long way with somebody who does have autism spectrum disorder. If you're meeting in person, you might see an individual that has poor spatial awareness. So they may be bumping into people, or they may sit very close because they don't have that spatial awareness. It's also not unusual to see what we refer to as self-stimming behavior. This is how somebody with autism spectrum disorder tries to integrate themselves or decrease their anxiety in an uncomfortable social situation. So you might see their hands flapping back and forth. They could be rocking. They can get really fidgety. They could be shaking their leg. You also might notice them tapping a pen or a pencil multiple times. They're really not doing this to be disruptive. They're really trying to integrate and bring down that anxiety level. You may see some individuals that present more with obsessive compulsion. You may have some with that attention deficit. You might see some individuals that lack sense of humor, or they don't understand idioms. So if a mediator very simply is going to say the ball's in your court, they may not understand that. And you may have to speak more literally, like, okay, now it's your turn to make that decision. And if you're going to meet in person, just a side note, and you're going to offer food, know that it's not unusual for people with autism spectrum disorder to have gluten-free preferences, casein-free preferences, and many times people also are they're just very restrictive, and they may eat a type of food from one manufacturer but not from another. So I hope some of these things just helped with becoming competent with autism spectrum disorder, help you become more sensitive to the uniqueness of the individual. And as we've heard here over and over today, being aware of your own biases, I feel very confident that you work with people who are on the autism spectrum disorder. It can be a very rewarding practice for you.
You made a point, and I think this is really relevant for not only for mediators, but in particular for anyone in the legal profession, lawyers, judges, anyone. You mentioned about the eye contact situation. In courtrooms, when witnesses take the stand, jurors, decide credibility issues based on a lot of presupposed things such as eye contact or failure to make eye contact. You could have a person with autism spectrum disorder testifying on the stand, they're not making eye contact, and a jury, which is not culturally competent or does not understand what they are actually seeing, reads that the very wrong way. And it could influence the outcome of a case that's based upon credibility. So the need to be culturally competent in this type of hypothetical, and really all of these hypotheticals, is just underscored, I think, by some of the points you brought out. All right, what we're going to do now is I want to talk about some specific situations concerning family law issues and custody. These are issues which are sometimes very tough for mediators to address, and we all have had to do these at one point or another. So, Judge Thornton, I'm going to ask you, are cultural considerations an appropriate consideration in custody cases, and how may they be explored, A, in court, and B, in mediation?
Larry, can I interrupt to give the attendance code?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, the first attendance code is 3214. 3214.
Okay, thank you, Carl. Judge Thornton, do you need me to repeat the question, or you got it? Okay.
No. And then maybe one of the mediators that's on the panel can jump in and talk about maybe their experience of how you would encounter them or really bring them to the forefront. So the answer has to be that they are very important. Cultural considerations are going to be very important when you're deciding a custody case. When I spoke to answer your first question, Judge, we talked about not making assumptions, right, based on if someone comes from a different race, religion, ethnic background, or class, right? And when you talk about issues that are really important in custody. Dating, right? There's a lot of cultural issues that come about with how you allow your children to date, how the parents really date, and what that conveys to their children and to their ex or soon to be ex spouse, right? The whole idea of, did you stay over? Did you let your boyfriend stay over? Did you stay over his house? Do you let your children go to their girlfriend's house and stay over? There are a lot of cultural issues. You know, I was raised in a pretty strict African American Baptist family, and sometimes when I speak to some of my friends, and they're like, "Oh yeah, Johnny's girlfriend stayed over last night." What? My parents would have a natural heart attack if any boyfriend or girlfriend stayed over. Even when you talk about if the family that you're dealing with is Catholic, not all Catholics are the same. Some are very conservative like that. Some are a little bit liberal. But when you're dealing with custody, you're going to be looking at dating issues, education. You know, I told you about the case that I had with the Jewish family, that there were a lot of cultural dynamics. And one of my dearest friends and my manager here in the civil division grew up in a very strict Jewish family. And she explained to me that for years, her parents did not speak to her because she was a little bit of an independent spirit, right? She went to Jewish school where her parents, she had 5 siblings. They paid more money than maybe for each child than someone would pay to go to Rutgers, right? To go to the Jewish school in Monmouth County, I'll say. That in their family, the girls were groomed to marry right out of high school. Some of them got married maybe during the prom. And the whole idea of being independent, standing on your own, you know, getting your own career, Mary Tyler Moore-ish type thing, that wasn't a part of her family. And she married a gentleman who was not Jewish, and her parents did not speak to her for many years. And so if you have some of these cases, it's really going to be important not to necessarily assume, and that's why you have to really dig and talk to people. In any trial that I've had, I don't assume if someone is from a different race, class, or ethnic background, that they think a certain way. During the course of the trial, I engage them, and that's how I pull it out. And you know what? When you engage people in that way, and whether you're a judge or a mediator, it's important that you develop that trust, right? You develop that trust by engaging them, pulling their differences or similarities out of them. And when you do that in a sensitive, concerned way, folks can usually feel and see that you're genuine, right? And then they trust you. And I think oftentimes you're able to get a lot more out of them than somebody that they feel that there's a wall there. But you know, when you talk about cultural differences, those cultural differences and those things that I found out in the trial, they ended up in the fact findings of many of my opinions.
So they are relevant. They are relevant.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just want to also make note that when couples do get together, even the amount of time that they're together, don't think that they have an understanding of each other's cultural differences. I have a case that I recall that even after 33 years together, it even became more important to each side about their original cultures and and the way their families were and everything. And they've become much more stoic on those beliefs during the divorce. So we should be aware of that and be cautious. The other thing is, and people do change when they get separated or divorced. I recall a case where the husband, they were both Christian, and the husband became a Seventh-day Adventist. Okay. And the wife thought it was blasphemy from moving away from a traditional Christian background. And this became an issue regarding how they were raising their child.
Good point. Raj, if you are mediating a dispute over a child's religious upbringing, sometimes two couples getting separated, they have different religious ideas, different cultural ideas. How do you attempt as a mediator to resolve that dispute between persons of different religious cultures in a culturally sensitive manner?
Yeah, it's this is something that happens and it's actually caused, in my experience, couples to break up, whether married or unmarried. I think the most sensitive and careful way to do it, and there's probably other ways that could be done, but I think the most sensitive and careful way is to make sure that both parties know that the judge is not going to pick a religion over the others. There's not going to be a case of trying, religion A versus religion B, even something that's much more common here, or versus something that's a little bit more foreign. That's really not going to be the issue for the judge to decide. So practically, you're going to be deciding it's really not going to be a major factor if you are unsuccessful in your mediation. And with that perspective, then if you can turn the focus to how to resolve the case to the person who perhaps is in a disadvantage from a factual standpoint in the custody situation, to try to preserve their religious upbringing that they want to instill into the child. Try to preserve that, because that's the only way the case is practical. That's the best way to get that person on board to settling the case, and then telling the other side, the person who has a little bit more of a factual advantage, that this is just an education. At the end of the day, the child's religious upbringing is going to be per the agreement, but it's not going to be necessarily the ultimate decision. If there's going to be a fundamental disagreement on any any issues while the child is a minor, then they could be addressed as and when they come. But at least both sides are exposed to, the child is exposed to both religions, and the child will go when they're older, wherever, whether it's one side, the other side, or a completely different direction. I think when big pictures of risks are involved, are considered, and sensitivity is put into context, especially for the person at a disadvantage, I think it's not a difficult issue to overcome. And if someone is a little bit more stubborn, who wants, it makes it a deal breaker. Just if they can't digest that the issue is not going to be decided by a fact finder, if it gets to that point, then you did what you could as a mediator, and you settle as much as you can, and on to the next one.
So, Alfonso, kind of an offshoot of that, sometimes you have disputes or issues, not so much about custody, but parenting time, and in particular, vacation disputes. One parent or the other wants to take the child on vacation overseas to their ancestral homeland, their cultural homeland. Could be off in Europe or Asia or Africa or anywhere, long distance away, and the other parent objects. So how might a culturally competent mediator attempt to resolve that dispute in a sensitive manner if the issue involves taking a young child out of the country to visit where the family roots are?
Well, first, Judge Jones, I want to thank you for sharing that the case that you had, that you wrote an opinion on regarding this matter, because I was actually going to go in a completely different discussion on this. Really, it's getting down to understanding the anxieties or concerns of the one spouse and why they would be against this trip for their child. And it's discussing those issues, and it could just be the separation is the main issue here, and not necessarily a cultural issue. It could just be the area of the world that they're concerned about going because of their perceived notion that it could be dangerous, or an incident can happen that could affect the child. But really, we want to talk to both parents in a way that, is this beneficial for the child? Is it for them to understand their culture, to understand their background, and where their families come from? That really provides the betterment of the child in their development.
The case that Alfonso is referencing is actually in your materials. There's a case called Lyle versus Lyle. It involved a mom wanting to take a young child to Holland. She was Dutch. And there was an argument, a dispute. And so the case really dealt to some degree with issues of the importance for a child to travel, not only be able to travel in general, but be able to learn about his or her own culture on both sides of the family tree. That's not a decision that would govern in every single case. But it is important to consider, and really when you're mediating cases, that it's about the child. The parents sometimes are busy having a fight with themselves, but it's really about the child. And should a child be allowed to, when they're old enough really to experience it, to see and explore about their own history? There could be an argument, yes, in many cases, and that's really what Lyle was about.
But one more
Judge,
point about this, Judge. I'm sorry. Ken, go ahead.
I was going to say it's very complex. And like, is it a 2-year-old child? Is it a 4-year-old child? And of course, we often approach such matters as how many days away can a child be from each parent at what different ages? But I would have also, now that I'm hearing this, I would have asked, before you two decided to separate, had you talked about how frequently you would be going back to see each of your parents, if it's both, or to see your parents? Had you talked about that? I want to know what they had really seen as appropriate before the divorce, as to what would be. Yes, we decided that when our daughter was 4 years old, it would start to make sense to go back to Holland, for example.
Right.
And then of course, there might be Hague Convention concerns as well in some of these cases. Gets very complicated, of course.
Right.
And that's what I was going to Ken, thank you for bringing those issues up. And that's why I think it's very important to bring up these travel vacation issues during any mediation, no matter the socioeconomic level that clients are at, because their situations can change later on. And this can become an area of dispute later on, especially when, as Ken was saying, if you're dealing with younger children now, as the parents get older and their incomes change, those situations can change. It's good to have that good discussion during the mediation to define that and create a framework for the couple.
Right. But sometimes remember, particularly if somebody's talking about going to their cultural homeland, maybe they have relatives there, maybe even grandma or grandpa, their direct relatives, that this could be a real sensitive issue for a lot of people. And it could be viewed as a sign of disrespect if the other parent doesn't let the child go. And on the other hand, the parent who doesn't want the child to go, it could be genuinely because they have fears or concerns about a child so young traveling so far away. So the key is to try to, in a respectful way, balance it out. Sometimes you see in these cases where there's a transition where you say, okay, not until the child hits a certain age, not too far in the future, but a certain age, and then the first year it could be for 7 days, and maybe the next year it could be for 10 or 14, a gradual building up so everyone can kind of get used to the situation a little bit. Obviously, if a country is at war or there are Hague Convention issues, you have to look at this, more closely. But there are cases out there where they've allowed people to travel when they were not signatories to the Hague Convention. There are reported opinions in New Jersey along those grounds, so you have to be, real careful with that stuff. But a lot of times it ends up being an issue of respect, and to try to basically make sure both sides feel respected in the process. Okay, Judge Thornton, what should someone do, and not just a mediator, but really anyone, as anyone in the court system, just in any walks of life, if he or she learns that they may have unintentionally offended someone culturally? Are there hypothetical or actual past examples of how someone, whether it's a mediator or anyone else, may have unknowingly offended someone culturally and was able to adjust in an appropriate and sensitive way?
I kind of think that you need to really address it. Whether you are a judge or a mediator, I think at the heart of the system is trust, right? So what we're trying to do is build trust, build integrity in the process. And so if you found out that you unintentionally offended someone, I've had that with some judges in the vicinage. One judge had a couple that was Spanish speaking, and he told them, I'm gonna have you go take ESL classes so you can learn to better communicate with your children. And I'm like, who told you that they can't communicate with their children? And since when do you need to speak English if you are Spanish speaking in this country? They've been getting along perfectly fine before they came into this courthouse. And like, that is not cool to tell somebody that. And it goes back to this whole idea of a sense of awareness. I was working on a fees case, and I was referencing an attorney, like when you're writing an opinion on fees, and the parties give you the names and the rates of other attorneys. And so I wanted to reference this one attorney who has appeared before me many times. And we're all not, fluent in, as you said at the top, Judge, we're all not fluent in a certain culture. And I happen to not be exactly fluent in same-sex language, right? Matter of fact, I remember having one of my clerks who is gay, and he told me, Judge, you can call gays queer. And I was like, no, I can't, Matthew, because he's like, no, really, that is acceptable language now to say queer. And I said, yeah, but when I was growing up, that was like an insult to call somebody queer. And I just can't get over the hump of what I was taught. I said, what if I happen to be speaking with somebody who is older and they think like me, right? They're not of the new lingo, right? And this young woman, I'm trying to figure out the right words. I can't, I'll just say that she presented, the way she presented to the world, her physical was, she has really, really short hair, and her style of dress is very masculine. Now, and if you recall,
what does that mean? What does that mean? Very masculine. You see,
you're right. You're right.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
You're
very
right.
masculine.
I'll say this: she wore a suit and a necktie. But I understand your point. She wore a suit and a necktie, and if you recall, over the last couple years, there's been a movement to, you can refer to folks, he, she, or it, right? And I didn't know what she was comfortable. I know that when she would appear in my courtroom, I would call her Miss. But as I was working on this opinion, I was like, am I offending her if I call her Miss? I don't know. And how should I refer to her in this opinion? And so I called her up and I said, Miss such and such, when you always come to my courtroom and you appear before me, I always refer to you as Miss, but as I sit here right now, I'm going to reference you in an opinion. I don't know if I was offending you when I would call you Miss, and I want to know how you want me to refer to you. She says, Judge, you did not offend me when you called me Miss, and you could refer to me as Miss in your opinion. And she said, her words were, my sexuality is a complicated issue. And so I just asked her, how is it that you want me to refer to you? And so I think that when you think you inadvertently offended somebody, you should kind of just take it head on. Because especially after I made that call to her, she knows that I would never do anything to hurt her or purposely offend her. And we have a level of trust between us.
And it's excellent advice, and words do matter. And as I said at the top of the program, in case anyone joined us late, we have in the materials, it was originally circulated through New Jersey State Bar Association. There is a summary sheet of appropriate terms or suggested terms to utilize presently with the LGBTQ community. So you may want to familiarize yourself with that, because you could be innocently or unknowingly, offending someone, and nobody ever wants to do that. So the more you learn, the less likely that's going to happen. Joni, what happens if a mediator finds that a party to family litigation may be showing signs of a traumatic stress from either the subject matter or the process itself, based on cultural factors?
Well, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, and the triggers can be multiple. So triggers can come at any time. And some people will respond like as if they're in a flashback where they're reliving it and responding to the way they were at that particular time. But other people respond in what we refer to as somatic responses from the underlying anxiety. And we might see this physically. Somebody might complain of a headache or stomach issues or even pain throughout their body. But I want to talk about the response of the adrenal glands very briefly, because these are our survival mechanisms. We all have them. It alerts us to whether there's some type of threat or danger, something that brings fear to us, and it heightens our senses. However, you might know of this or heard of it through the fight or flight response. Now, there's a surge of hormones, and those surge of hormones can vary in intensity. And it sets off our autonomic nervous system, which can increase our blood pressure. It can increase our respiratory rate. It can increase our heart rate or our temperature. We can see people that become very sweaty. Some people might get tremors. Some might get dizzy. Some might experience some blurred vision. And some might actually go into panic. So I just want to mention something very briefly about a panic attack. When people go into panic attacks, the individual may feel like they're going to die, but usually people don't die from panic attacks. Usually lasts about 5 or 10 minutes. But I do want to get just a little touch upon the subject of what happens with these hormone surges as it affects the brain and thinking. So you can be set into the side of the brain that is very impulsive. And when you're in that side of the brain, you may not understand logic. There's an inability to problem solve because people are becoming very reactionary to what they believe is happening and not to the facts. And we see this very often when you're working for hours and hours on end and we're not reaching to, this logical thinking or this problem solving. So we really want to cross that bridge and get into the other side of the brain where it's not so reactionary. There is logical thinking. There is the ability to look at the facts objectively and to get to those appropriate decision-making processes, which is all what's part of this mediation. So what can a mediator do? Well, during the mediation process, we know mediators are pretty observant and look for any change in the person. So it could be some of the things that I had discussed, but somebody might become very teary-eyed. They might become very fidgety and uncomfortable. And I usually recommend considering, a breakout session for both. And I personally recommend speaking with the non-affected individual first. And the reason why I say that is that these hormonal surges can really last for about 1 to 2 hours before they start to come back to normal. So by the time that some time has gone by and you've gotten to the affected individual, you can better gauge where you're at with that person. Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Or are they stabilizing? And it's okay to pair with the emotions. So you can say you appear anxious, but it's not recommended to pry into what the traumatic event might be, because this can really heighten their traumatic responses. If an individual volunteers, though, to talk about it, that's perfectly fine. Use your effective listening skills. This must have been pretty scary for you. Or, it's also not recommended to say that exactly how they feel, because no one really knows exactly how another person feels, do they? So you can say, I may not know exactly how you feel, but I certainly can relate. So being that social support, being reassuring, keeping them mindful, keeping them here and now in the present. because the key to the de-escalation is your relationship. And I know Judge Thornton touched upon this a couple times. It's a matter of being seen as that solid object, because when people start to lose control, they want to attach to something solid. Like, for instance, if I'm going to fall and I see a chair and I want to grab onto that chair to break my fall, but I see that the leg is broken, I'm probably not going to hold on to that chair. So what makes a solid object in a mediator? Well, it's somebody who remains calm, confident, centered, empathetic, focused, allowing that connection to take place. Because again, I'm going to go back to what we heard multiple times here, this trust versus this mistrust. And, utilize your gut. If you have any pre-notion that something was a trigger, or maybe the person has even come out and stated it, try to avoid that. But there's a very important decision that needs to be made at this part as a mediator, in my opinion. And it really depends on where you are at the process and where the individual is, because you may want to break for lunch and give some time, to let those hormones go back down to a more acceptable range, to get them into the side of the brain so they can look at things more logically and make those decisions, or you may want to schedule it for another day. And if you're going to schedule something for another day, it's perfectly fine to remind them that this is a very stressful time. And if they take some measures to take care of themselves, such as getting enough sleep, getting, eating the right foods, or even doing some calming activities, by the time that you are meeting again, I think that this could greatly help the process.
You're talking essentially about styles of mediation. Raj, let me ask you this. Can the choice of mediation style be affected by the culture of the persons you're mediating with?
Absolutely. And I think it flows in wonderfully from what Joni was just saying, because sometimes the imbalances in the parties, whether it's male, female, man, woman, whatever, man, woman, whether it's just based on the dynamic between them, sometimes there's an imbalance in attorney presentation. That all is impacted in part, at least, by culture, and that can make you decide whether to caucus versus to have everyone kind of like in one meeting, in one room, to kind of flesh out and address any kinds of issues. Even more fundamentally, I mean, sometimes, we operate based on certain like cultural norms as to how offers are made and how settlement discussions and mediation progress is had. There are some cultures that we're taught a lot of times, right or wrong, to make an aggressive offer, but not something that is just completely outrageous. And if you don't know that the cultural background of the parties essentially demands an outrageous offer to come from someone, you may try to talk someone out of the beginning of a course of conduct that may, believe it or not, reach a settlement. So having even that, getting rid of those preconceptions, those things that were perhaps taught even on a lot of these mediation seminars, getting rid of those and trying to understand who the person is, why they're making that offer, and perhaps letting them make it, it may get you really, if not all the way there, really close to where you want it to go in a mediation session. And that is impacted in large part by their culture.
I'm sorry, Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to, maybe NJAPM can maintain a list that if you get a referral and you don't feel that culturally competent, that there's a person on our membership who can help you with that. We would need people to develop this list, how fine-tuned it should be. I remember years ago at our center, we're talking about a long time ago, like, what foreign languages do you do you speak well enough to conduct the mediation and for referral purposes? But maybe NJAPM can lead the way in this. We can put it on our website even and say, yeah, we will find if we can a culturally competent, something like that. This is perhaps something the committee can work on.
Sure, it might be a very good idea from one mediator to another mediator, that type of
Yeah,
thing. It could be very helpful.
I've done that when if I'm not familiar with a couple coming in and I'm very experienced, and yet I haven't seen everyone, of course, I will reach out to someone I know who can give me some orientation as to things I should be aware of, and maybe we should all be doing that more automatically.
Perhaps, and everyone would have to know, who knows what information, that type of thing.
We'd have to have a way to,
sure.
We'd have to have a way to share that, of course.
Sure. Sounds like a good idea. Ken, let me ask you this. You're mediating a case and people are bringing up, they come from another country, another culture, another country, and they keep going back to what the laws are in another country. What role, if any, do another nation's laws have in the mediation process, even if they're not binding in a courtroom?
I saw that we were going to have that question, and I thought about it. It's not a question I had thought about before. I sometimes have asked people in other situations where we didn't have same-sex marriage, and a same-sex couple came in because they weren't married, but they were getting divorced nevertheless, in quotes. I remember asking people, now it's not an issue for a long time, I remember asking people, do you want to follow what would be the law here as if you were married? I'm thinking of that as comparable. I might say, do you want, of course, the laws here in New Jersey are different, as you know, as they are in every jurisdiction. How much do you want to follow the laws from whatever country they're from? How important is that you want to follow that? And you'll need to help me understand it. Is it important to you or not? And I would try to, but realizing when they go to their review attorneys, the attorneys are going to say, no, we don't have to do that. But, it used to matter much more, in my experience, seeing a couple, talking about 35 to 40 years ago, who came from another culture where with young children, it was assumed that the father would have custody, where there was no basis for it here. And I said, how important is it for you to follow this and be aware that your attorneys are going to tell you that that's not how we do it here right now? So I think I would always ask people that question and try to take that into account in my mediation.
Okay. The next question, Judge Thornton had touched upon it a little bit previously, but I want to put this out to Raj and also to Alfonso. Concerning sexual identity issues. How may a culturally competent mediator address sexual identity issues in a way which may lower the possibility of, number one, inadvertently offending someone, and number two, just as importantly, trying to build bridges of trust and reach resolutions in the mediation process? Raj?
I'll go first, I guess, and just touching on what Judge Thornton said, I think at the beginning of our seminar, Lisa Burke, who is actually listening in, she is in my opinion, the guru of a lot of these diversity issues, and I've learned a lot personally from her on whether it's sexual identity issues, gender identity issues. There is a difference between the two, and in terms of how best to address the issues when it comes to mediation. Sometimes you, as long as you're aware of what you don't know, and you make yourself a little bit more vulnerable to the attendees at the mediation, and you'll start to ask questions that will get them kind of explaining what their identity, whether there are any identity issues, and if so, what they are, and perhaps from there, you may realize whether there are roadblocks that you may have to overcome to getting to a successful resolution at mediation, and even more fundamentally, making sure that the mediation process is starts ideally and in a sensitive and respectful way for the sake of the mediation and for the sake of not offending or upsetting anyone, especially at the beginning of the process.
Right. Alfonso?
Recently, I got a referral from our school's guidance counselor because of an issue related to this. She referred the parents to me because the husband was extremely traditional and conservative, and the wife became a little more Americanized, and their child in high school was identifying as male instead of female. And under state law, the guidance counselor in the school district has to refer to the child, the way that they prefer to be identified. But in this manner, the child asked the guidance counselor and through the referral asked me to just refer to her as her gender of birth. So it's really because she didn't want any trouble with the family, even though they were going through a divorce. So it's being conscious of these issues, asking the questions so that you don't make the assumptions, and find out what people are more comfortable with, especially, the same way we would ask someone how would they like to be addressed by their name, asking those other questions regarding how else would you like to be addressed.
Thank you. Before we go to the questions, I know we only have about 15 minutes left. I just want to ask each of the panelists, we'll kind of go around the screen here, to each offer a final personal takeaway point, perhaps words of personal advice for persons seeking to become culturally competent as possible and to increase inclusion opportunities for mediators as well. Judge Thornton, I'd like to start with you.
Just to reiterate about usually people that are concerned with being culturally competent have a certain level of emotional intelligence, right? Because they understand and they want to do the right thing, and they want to be successful, right? Because when you are culturally competent, you're going to be successful. And it's difficult to ask some of those questions or to engage and have some of those conversations for fear that somebody will pounce on you, right? So it's even when I was giving my comments and I said, oh, she dressed like a man. And Dr. Ken said, what does that mean? Right? What does that mean? And a lot of people are a little hesitant to engage in that conversation because they're afraid of what somebody might say or think, right? And I just think that when your heart is right, you're going to ask the question. You're going to ask the question and you're going to engage someone in a certain way. And you're not going to be moved when somebody like Mr. Ken jumps up and says, what does that mean? What does that mean? That's not going to bother you in the least, right?
But Judge, he does that daily, apparently.
I
so
could
that's
imagine.
the way it goes. Yeah. Especially around lunchtime, apparently. Thank you. Raj, any final thoughts?
Yeah, it's fundamentally it's about being humble. I mean, you could be of some kind of ethnic ilk, or some kind of diverse, be some kind of a diverse category, or you could have 30, 40, 50 years in. At the end of the day, you do not know everything, and if you're mindful of that, and if you tread accordingly with your perspective, with the people who are coming in seeking your help and your guidance. And if you come in with a clean slate and without presupposing any kind of information because you may have studied it or because you may have friends of a similar cultural or sexual orientation background, whatever the case may be, when you do that, you will ask the right questions, you will ask the right follow-up questions, you will seek the right information, and you will get as much as you possibly can to treat the process and the individuals with respect. And you may not get everything that you need, but you'll be comfortable with yourself in terms of how you executed it. And you could always backtrack. There's nothing wrong with apologizing or asking more questions after you learn something that perhaps you didn't know. And your audience will realize that. They will appreciate that, and it'll set you up for a successful mediation.
Ken?
Yeah, the more this has been very helpful to me. The more I think about it, I have to be aware of my biases towards working with people who may have different political points of view than myself. And this is a very serious one today. And I know we can make all kinds of remarks about it, but I really have to work on that. I became aware of that from today's discussion. We all have to work on that. And we talk about inclusion. We really need to deal with that. But as I said earlier, we really need to get in touch. We need to take the implicit bias test. We need to get in touch. We should all make a list, and I'll start with myself, of where do we have problems? Where are our biases? What kind of couples would trigger our biases? Everyone better have a list. Everyone better. No one can say, I don't have, not me, not me. We need to get in touch with our own issues.
Alfonso?
I'm going to continue with what Ken was saying, because this was something Ken had brought up a lot during his education, in his mediation class and his practicum, of being aware of your biases, but also of your unknown biases. Me being a Cuban American, I had originally in my youth a thought of what being Hispanic was, and then as I grew, I learned that being Hispanic or Latin is not the same thing for every person, and can be very different, even within the groups that you think you know already about. So it's being aware of that and just being curious and open to understanding those things is really important for a mediator.
Joni?
Well, I'm going to go back to what Judge Thornton said, because in her great example, it showed how much the relationship that you build is important. We don't want the focus of the competency and the sensitivity to take away from the fluency of the mediation process. But one of the things that Ken brought up, that if you sit here and you go through all the trainings and you utilize all your resources and you let this occur naturally, you are going to learn the strategies that you need to feel comfortable seeking clarification, asking questions, what to do if you make a mistake. So if there's one thing I would say to take away from, is not to let it take, so much of your focus that it's going to take away from the fluency of your practice.
Thank you. Before we go to the questions, Carl, do we have the next code number?
Yes, the next attendance code is 4123. 4123.
Okay, thank you. So everyone who's attending should have gotten an email with the certificate to fill out if you're seeking either CLE credits or continuing professional education credits, to fill out the applicable form with the codes and send those in. So
Larry, let me just mention, if you registered before 11 o'clock this morning, you've already received the materials. If you registered after 11 o'clock, I will be sending the program materials and the various forms out after the close of the program.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I also just want to give a quick shout out. When we were preparing this, I was speaking with different people. We're getting all kinds of different input, but there was a fellow I actually met online. He's the head of the Iranian Bar Association in California, named Abbas Hajian. And he set up several years ago in California a program called Cultural Competency in Family Practice. It's not specific to mediation, but it involved family practice. And it grew and grew and grew. And in California, they do an annual conference on this, involving judges and lawyers and mediators and all different people in the family court profession. And I was really, really impressed with what they did and the point of the message, which was well before cultural competency really got as much on the radar as it did recently. So I asked him, number one, if I could give him a shout out, and he said okay. And also, hopefully, the NJAPM can work with organizations such as Cultural Competency in Family Practice in California and other organizations to try to really grow this so that we learn as much about cultural competency as possible, particularly mediators who, so much of the practice has now gone online. And because it's online, the number of people you may reach, people you may be involved with, may grow as well as a result. It's not necessarily as limited as it perhaps used to be. So if anyone looks it up, if you Google it, it's Cultural Competency and Family Practice. There's a whole organization out in California, and I personally found their resources to be very, very valuable. All right, we have the last 5 or 10 minutes here. We have some questions. Let me just take a look here, see what we have. Raj, there's a question for you. It looks like a cultural awareness and equitable distribution. The concept of dowry, it means different things in different cultures. How would you deal with that?
I think the question is directed to me a little bit because there's a case called Odatalla versus Odatalla. It's a 2002 published trial court decision out of our state, and it has to do with what's called the mahr. When Muslims get married, the man has to give the husband has to give the bride a gift. It could be whatever they negotiate. It could be $1, it could be $1 million. Most of that, if it's a high amount of money, usually most of that is deferred. So a lot of it is deferred and essentially is just part of the agreement, but it's never enforced unless there's a divorce. Now, in that case, there was a divorce, and the bride, the wife, she wanted to enforce the deferred part of the mahr, and that's not an equitable distribution issue whatsoever. That is separate and apart. That is a contract issue. So separating that, if there may be an education issue when it comes to a dowry in terms of getting a refund. A dowry customarily is paid by the bride or the bride's family to the husband or the husband's family to take on, and I say this cynically, take on the quote unquote burden of the wife or burden of the lady. Those issues in terms of reimbursement, I don't think that's an equitable distribution issue. That is separate and apart, and there may be an educational part of the mediation process to explain if someone wants a quote unquote refund, how that may not work out the same way that a mahr is contractual, the same way how an engagement ring becomes contractual. But if that becomes a huge roadblock in the mediation, then it becomes a cost benefit analysis to the other side. Do they want to not settle their divorce over X number of dollars? Is there a way to meet in the middle? It's not based on if you can overcome the principle of the issue and try to break it down into dollars. If that can be worked out, then I think that you're keeping in mind culture, but you're not being super rigid to the law. Then hopefully you can get the parties somewhere to a yes and making a deal.
Thank you. And then Joni, it looks like there's a question from Bruce indicating, so if you recognize that a client may be on the spectrum, how would you approach it if it hasn't been disclosed? Any thoughts on that?
Sure, it doesn't have to be disclosed. We're not defined by any of our diagnoses. So we're going to treat the natural environment with the individual. And the reason for the competency is that you're aware of if there's any of these traits, that there aren't these biases or these assumptions that are being made, and also some strategies on how to deal with it should they be present. But I absolutely don't think that it has to be disclosed at all.
Okay. And I think it looks like all other questions, it seems, was answered. There's not a question, but a comment here about how in someone in the Canadian Supreme Court dealing with Sharia law, that it was handled with fairness and balance. What a lesson in cultural competence and discussion. Sure, we all aspire to obviously have success stories, to have stories where everyone felt that they were culturally respected and were treated in a sensitive and competent manner. There's another question here. Let's see, from Gary. When would it be appropriate to refer out the mediation to a religious group leader? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Ken?
Yeah, I think I've had a couple of occasions where I brought in the religious group leader to the mediation session and had that person as part of the mediation. I've asked people to speak to their spiritual leader, and there are some cases on this actually where a marriage was a religious ceremony and the person did not record it, as it was supposed to. This is a New York City notable case, but I have brought in, look, I am for including other people into the mediation session, not just someone's accountant, but their spiritual leader as well. I find that to be very helpful.
Okay. And I don't see if there are any other questions. Does not appear to be. I just want to remind all attendees again, I said this at the outset, we have part 2 with a different panel of wonderful speakers on March 9th. And that specifically focuses on civil mediation in the civil context. Anyone who signed up for this program should have the same information in the materials relative to the civil program. It's going to be handled the same way from 12 to 1:40 p.m. on a Tuesday, March 9th. And hopefully you'll be able to join us. And there was a reference, there was a question before, I believe Anju had put it up, in the with reference to the test, the implicit bias test in the materials. If you go to the part of the materials that gives you the list of links, the test itself isn't published in the materials. It's the link to the materials which is there. If you go to the very bottom, the last 2 items are is the test and also the LGBTQ phraseology. So if you click on that link, it should get you right to it, or you cut and paste the link into your browser and it should get you there. In any event, we have only about 2 or 3 minutes left. Again, I want to thank all of the panelists, Judge Thornton, Raj, Ken, Alfonso, Joni. I want to thank Carl Cangelosi, our technical director, who was really instrumental in helping set this up, and really everybody involved in NJAPM, including our president, Carl Peters, Suzanne English and Diane Longo helped with the promotion, the Mitsu helped with the continuing education credits. I'm really happy that we were able to do this. And again, hopefully this will be an annual event and it will grow and you'll all participate. And again, you all also get the, those who have applied for the credits, get the new diversity and inclusion credits for attending this program, which as of January 2021 became mandatory for attorneys in the state of New Jersey. You get 2 credits for this program and then 2 credits for the next program. So you get a lot of credits for those of you who are stockpiling those credits. But more importantly, I hope you gained a lot of knowledge and information. You'll be able to, food for thought, you'll be able to not only share with your colleagues, but also utilize in your mediation practices, as we're all on the same journey trying to become as culturally competent and sensitive as possible in a very multicultural world. Thank you all for attending and best of luck to all. And that will conclude our presentation for today. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks.